Iran, long underestimated and often mischaracterized, demonstrated a strategic maturity that stunned the very architects of Western defense. The retaliation came like a carefully timed sequence in nature, not erratic, not emotional, but deliberate. First, the silence, a deceptive calm. Then, in coordinated waves, the sky above key military zones lit up, not in celebration, but with the raw display of sovereign defiance. Missiles, drones, and precision strikes unfolded in real time, catching seasoned intelligence communities in disbelief. World leaders watched in dismay, not just because of the destruction, but because their predictions, carefully modeled and simulated, crumbled instantly. How did they miss the signs? How had a nation under sanctions, surrounded by threats, cultivated such silent capability? Beyond the physical strikes lay an invisible front, the digital domain. Servers crashed. Satellite feeds froze. Oil markets convulsed. For the first time in decades, the economic centers of the West felt the pulse of Middle Eastern strength echo through their own systems. And yet, perhaps the most profound tremor was not technological but psychological. Alliances began to wobble. The usual diplomatic tongues fell silent, replaced by whispered consultations behind closed doors. What had changed was not just Iran's position, here was a nation that had learned, adapted, and patiently bided its time. It did not retaliate to start a war, it retaliated to be heard, loudly, clearly, unmistakably. And in that clarity, the world was forced to listen. As renowned naturalist and observer of life's intricate dance, David Attenborough, often reminds us, it is not the largest or the loudest that survive, but those that evolve with intention, resilience, and strategy. We are witnessing a turning point, not just in policy, but in the rhythm of international power. And as with all turning points in nature, this event underscores Attenborough's wisdom. The world may not forget this moment, not for its destruction, but for the reminder that beneath the surface, forces of quiet strength are always rising, waiting for the world to misjudge them one final time. The unprecedented scale of Iran's retaliation marked a defining moment in recent geopolitical history. Traditionally, Iran has been viewed through the lens of sanctions, internal dissent, and limited regional influence. However, when provoked beyond its threshold, Iran revealed a much more organized, disciplined, and expansive military response than global powers had anticipated. What made the retaliation truly shocking was not only the volume of strikes but the integration of various technologies and tactical layers, which created an overwhelming strategic effect. The attack didn't come from a single front or in a linear form. Instead, Iran unleashed a wave of missiles, long-range drones, and cyber operations, all synchronized with alarming accuracy. It was not a haphazard burst of aggression but a meticulously premeditated show of strength. Multiple strategic bases across the region came under simultaneous pressure, challenging even the most advanced defense systems of opposing forces. The sheer quantity and diversity of the weapons used illustrated years of hidden preparation and quiet buildup, contrary to the belief that Iran's capabilities were limited by economic constraints and international isolation. In this act of retaliation, Iran didn't just aim to respond, it sought to redefine the psychological balance in the region. The decision to deploy such a wide range of technologies, from ballistic missiles to stealth drones, indicated not only capability but intent. Iran had clearly mapped out various scenarios and was prepared for escalation, signaling that it could match force with force. This was not just a counterpunch, it was a reminder that the country was no longer a passive participant in the global order, but a state with initiative and autonomy in the face of provocation. Intelligence analysts around the world were forced to confront a painful truth: their models underestimated both Iran's operational reach and its technological adaptation. Most military assessments had focused on Iran's past behaviors and economic disadvantages, not on its capacity for surprise. The failure to foresee such a complex and large-scale response exposed a gap in global threat perception. What made the retaliation even more significant was its precision. Iran wasn't striking at random, it was choosing its targets deliberately, making each strike count both strategically and symbolically. This was warfare as communication, with every missile delivering not just destruction but a message. Iran's retaliation stood out not for its sheer destructiveness but for its remarkable strategic precision. Unlike the conventional notion of a retaliatory strike, which often seeks to overwhelm or intimidate through chaos and massive force, Iran's approach was measured, methodical, and deliberately calibrated. The operation focused on specific military objectives, infrastructure nodes, and communication networks, signaling that the response was rooted in clear intelligence and refined strategy. This precision suggested not only technological advancement but also a deep understanding of psychological and geopolitical messaging. Targets were chosen for their symbolic and strategic value. For instance, air bases housing foreign troops and logistics hubs critical to regional operations were struck with uncanny accuracy. This wasn't merely about causing damage, it was about demonstrating capability. Iran sought to disarm and humiliate, not to start a full-blown war. The selection of targets suggested extensive pre-planning, detailed reconnaissance, and a carefully maintained playbook, ready to be activated under specific thresholds of provocation. The response communicated a single chilling idea: Iran had been preparing for this, and it had been watching closely. In modern warfare, precision is more powerful than brute force. It sends a clear message to adversaries that every move has been calculated, that every consequence is intentional. Iran's decision to avoid civilian casualties and limit collateral damage added another layer of tactical sophistication. It allowed Iran to retain a sense of moral high ground while still making a powerful statement of strength. This was not an act of recklessness but one of restraint within controlled ferocity. Observers around the globe were left analyzing the depth of planning required to execute such a balanced response. It shattered long-standing assumptions that Iran's military operations would be clumsy or reactionary. Instead, the retaliation revealed an evolving doctrine focused on deterrence through precision, not provocation. The global community began to see that Iran had entered a new phase of strategic identity, one that values tactical impact over emotional reaction. This shift in behavior had major implications for military planners worldwide. It suggested that future engagements would not be simple or predictable. It forced adversaries to reassess not just Iran's tools of war, but its entire approach to conflict. The retaliation became a case study in using control, accuracy, and targeted power as instruments of geopolitical negotiation through force. The global intelligence failure surrounding Iran's retaliation exposed a critical vulnerability in even the most advanced surveillance and analytical systems maintained by world powers. Despite the immense resources invested in satellite monitoring, signal interception, cyber surveillance, and regional human intelligence, the magnitude, coordination, and timing of Iran's response came as a complete surprise to those who believed they had a firm grasp on the country's capabilities. This failure wasn't just about missing the moment of attack, it was a broader misjudgment of Iran's strategic posture, technological advancement, and political will. For years, intelligence agencies relied heavily on conventional metrics such as troop movements, weapons testing, and internal political shifts to gauge the likelihood of Iranian retaliation. Yet Iran had evolved its methods, concealing its intentions behind decentralized planning, hardened communications, and misdirection. The most advanced spy satellites and eavesdropping programs were unable to detect the buildup because Iran adapted with discipline, using a mix of underground infrastructure, covert supply chains, and encrypted coordination across regional allies. The very intelligence tools once believed to be infallible proved inadequate against this level of strategic deception. Adding to the failure was the overconfidence among policymakers who assumed that sanctions and diplomatic pressure had crippled Iran's ability to act decisively. This misperception led to a downplaying of the country's evolving military doctrine and over-reliance on outdated threat assessments. Intelligence agencies also underestimated Iran's regional intelligence networks, which were used not only to gather information but also to shape and distort the perceptions of Western analysts. This created a false sense of security where even high-ranking officials were blindsided by the scope and scale of the retaliatory operation. What made the intelligence failure even more consequential was its domino effect. As soon as the retaliation occurred, global leaders realized they had made decisions based on flawed data and misread signals. It eroded confidence in intelligence briefings and forced urgent internal reviews across multiple defense establishments. Questions were raised about whether the failure stemmed from a lack of resources, faulty assumptions, or cultural biases within intelligence agencies that had long underestimated Iran's resilience and ingenuity. This intelligence gap didn't just have military implications, it had diplomatic consequences as well. Allies began questioning the reliability of shared intelligence, and adversaries took note of the breach in situational awareness. In an age where information dominance is often equated with power, the inability to foresee Iran's bold response revealed that even the most technologically sophisticated nations remain vulnerable to strategic surprise. The ripple effects across global alliances following Iran's retaliation were immediate and deeply unsettling to the established order. As the strikes unfolded and the world grasped the extent of Iran's precision and coordination, allied nations began to reassess their positions, not only regarding Iran but also in relation to their dependence on Western military leadership. Countries that had long stood in diplomatic alignment with the United States found themselves caught between public solidarity and private concern, recognizing that the anticipated deterrent power of Western influence had been challenged. Iran's actions did not isolate it. It forced the global stage to reckon with its presence and capacity. Several regional players, particularly in the Middle East, began recalibrating their security strategies. Gulf states, once confident in the protective umbrella of Western military power, quietly initiated back-channel talks and diplomatic feelers toward Iran, seeking to avoid direct entanglement in any future escalations. These countries understood that being perceived as launchpads or logistical partners for Western operations could make them primary targets in any future conflict. Iran's retaliation had reshaped the calculus. Neutrality or quiet diplomacy now seemed safer than open alignment. Beyond the Middle East, global powers in Europe and Asia began questioning the stability of current alliances. NATO members expressed concern over the lack of preparedness and foresight exhibited by leading intelligence agencies. The notion that one of the most watched and sanctioned countries could still deliver such an effective and unpredictable response undermined confidence in the existing global security framework. In strategic terms, it exposed fault lines within coalitions that had grown reliant on predictable threats and routine engagements. At the same time, rival nations closely observed the geopolitical tremors. Countries like Russia and China saw the situation as an affirmation of their long-standing narrative that Western dominance was waning and that alternative power structures could rise with regional legitimacy. Iran's ability to shift the tone of global diplomacy with a single act of retaliation served as a signal that smaller powers, when armed with patience, strategy, and regional influence, could alter global dynamics in ways disproportionate to their size or economic power. This shift in global alliances was not marked by formal treaties or immediate declarations, but by a quiet, steady realignment of interests, caution, and strategy. It created a new atmosphere of uncertainty where loyalty became transactional, and alliances were no longer taken for granted. Iran's retaliation did not rely solely on physical strikes, it expanded the battlefield into the digital and economic spheres, signaling a multidimensional approach to modern conflict. One of the most notable elements of the response was the use of coordinated cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure and military communication networks across multiple nations. These digital offensives disrupted radar systems, temporarily blinded surveillance capabilities, and created confusion among command chains. The attacks demonstrated that Iran possessed not only physical firepower but also a sophisticated understanding of cyber warfare, capable of penetrating and destabilizing technologically advanced systems. In parallel, Iran's actions triggered significant disruptions to global oil supply chains, with key transport routes such as the Strait of Hormuz placed under threat. Oil prices spiked almost instantly, tankers were rerouted, insurance on shipping surged, and investors across financial markets reacted to the uncertainty with panic. This economic fallout had global implications, touching energy-dependent nations far beyond the Middle East. Markets in Asia and Europe felt the tremors as stock indexes fluctuated, and energy companies faced immediate pressure to stabilize supply commitments. Iran had, in effect, used its geographic leverage over energy corridors as a pressure point against the global economy, reminding the world of its strategic positioning. These economic and cyber components of the retaliation were not incidental, they were clearly part of a larger, integrated strategy. The goal was to maximize pressure not just on military adversaries but on the political and financial systems that sustain them. Iran knew that a direct confrontation with superpowers in traditional military terms would be costly and unwise. Instead, by targeting the arteries of economic and digital infrastructure, it shifted the cost-benefit analysis of conflict in its favor. The cyber attacks did not need to be permanent, their very occurrence exposed vulnerabilities that could be exploited again, keeping adversaries in a constant state of readiness and uncertainty. Furthermore, the retaliation sent a message to multinational corporations and global investors, warning that geopolitical tensions with Iran could bring real and immediate economic consequences. This moved the conversation from war rooms into boardrooms, from generals to CEOs. In doing so, Iran's strategy expanded the scope of conflict, showing that influence in the modern world extends far beyond the battlefield. Economic instability and cyber disruption proved to be as powerful as missiles, capable of undermining confidence and exerting pressure in less visible but equally impactful ways. The global perception of power underwent a significant transformation following Iran's retaliation, as the event redefined what strength means in the modern geopolitical context. For decades, power has often been associated with the possession of nuclear arsenals, advanced air forces, or sprawling military alliances. However, Iran's measured yet forceful response challenged this notion by demonstrating that strategic depth, regional influence, and psychological leverage can be just as impactful as conventional might. Iran's display of strength came not from dominating territory or overpowering enemies, but from reshaping narratives. It showed that a nation need not match the West plane for plane or missile for missile to be effective. Instead, it wielded its capabilities with purpose, knowing exactly when and where to strike to maximize influence while minimizing unnecessary escalation. This recalibrated the global understanding of what it means to be a power player. Nations that had once been categorized as secondary actors were now seen as capable of influencing the actions of world powers through asymmetric means, regional alliances, and strategic resilience. This shift deeply unsettled traditional power centers. The realization that a heavily sanctioned and diplomatically pressured state could still orchestrate such a sophisticated and widely impactful retaliation forced military and political institutions to revisit their assumptions. No longer could military budgets and hardware alone define security. Intelligence, cultural insight, cyber capabilities, and domestic unity began to emerge as equally important pillars of strength. Iran's ability to sustain internal cohesion despite economic pressure and to time its response with political clarity reinforced the idea that modern power is as much about psychological dominance and readiness as it is about force. Additionally, the response changed how populations around the world viewed conflict. In many countries, public opinion shifted from seeing Iran as an isolated threat to recognizing its role as a strategic actor resisting perceived imperial overreach. This narrative shift, amplified by global media and digital platforms, added a soft power dimension to Iran's display. The retaliation became not just a military event but a symbol of redefining power in an era where information, patience, and resilience can sometimes outweigh brute strength. It opened the door for other nations to consider alternative pathways to influence, challenging the old world order and hinting at the emergence of a more complex and multipolar future. In the aftermath of Iran's unprecedented retaliation, the world witnessed not just a military response but a strategic awakening. Iran reshaped global perceptions of power through precision, patience, and multidimensional impact across the military, digital, economic, and psychological domains. Intelligence systems failed, alliances trembled, markets reacted, and the balance of fear subtly shifted. This was not a reckless act of war but a calculated reminder that true strength lies not only in weapons but in will, resilience, and timing. The global order, once confident in its structure, now finds itself facing a new era where underestimated nations can speak the loudest with the fewest moves. The rules of engagement are changing, and those who fail to adapt will be left behind. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this powerful reflection on a turning point in modern geopolitics. May this message inspire awareness, critical thought, and a deeper understanding of the world we live in. Stay informed, stay courageous, and never stop questioning the narratives around you. Good luck on your journey forward, and thank you for watching, listening, and thinking.